Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to this last session for the first day of our conference, the CRADLE Conference, the panel on what it means to be a student in a post-digital age. And I've certainly had a very full day. My brain is feeling very stimulated by many of the presentations I've seen, and I hope that those of you who've joined for the whole conference are feeling the same way. I'd like to begin by an acknowledgement of country. You will have heard this on and off during the day. The Deakin words, I think they're really heartfelt. As we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in so doing, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the lands on which we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. And I think it's so true. We are very dispersed and very virtually constructed. And that's, I think, so significant for this panel, because I mean, certainly for me, I have been living in a world that's almost entirely constructed by the digital. Here in Melbourne, which is where most of us from CRADLE are, and many of us joining, a few weeks ago, the only embodied contacts I had were with my family, the friends within 5 kilometres who could schedule walks with me, the people at food outlets and supermarkets, and I think once a healthcare professional. So everything else was mediated with the digital, with my mobile phone, with computer, with tablets, keyboards, and all of my social and knowledge and working contact was through these mediums. And this was for our students, all of their contact with their institutions, with their learning. And so I think this has enormous implications before lockdown, amplified by lockdown and beyond lockdown, into what this means for our students, both generally in terms of being a student, how does that look, how will that look, and also for learning. And those two things are much overlap, but they're not entirely the same. But first of all, I'd like to announce a change in lineup. Professor Helen Partridge would love to be with us right now, but unfortunately she's not available. She's fine, but really sends her deepest apologies. Instead, we've invited Dr. Joanna Tai, who will introduce herself shortly, also from the CRADLE team, who will take on, Helen was really going to be talking from an equity perspective, and we've asked Jo to step into her shoes. What the format's going to be, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, then we'll start with a series of questions. There's no prepared slides, it's going to be entirely discussion format. I'm going to ask a series of questions that are pre-prepared or that people have had some time to think about, and then we'll open up to you, probably a little bit after each question or after each question set, but also at the end of questions as well. So it's going to be a mix of facilitated questions and your questions. We hope to get as much rich comment and questioning as you possibly can. And my colleague Trina, who also, maybe you could introduce yourself as well during the overall introductions, will be doing the Q&A moderation for us, as she did in the first session this morning. So to get started, panel, can you please briefly introduce yourselves? And let's go to the person on my screen first, which is Simon. Simon, would you start with your introduction, please?
Thanks, Margaret, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Simon Buckingham Shum. I'm the director of the Connected Intelligence Centre at UTS, University of Technology, Sydney. Not quite so locked down as my Melbourne colleagues. I'm a professor of learning informatics, and I'm really interested in the human-centered design of educational technology. That's particularly tools that are powered by data and analytics and AI.
Thanks, Simon. Dave, you're next to my screen.
Yes, well, I think you've seen a bit of me already. I'm Dave Boud. I'm the director of CRADLE. That's the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin. And the delights of the digital mean that although I'm in Sydney, I'm pretending to be in the office, which is completely close to us in downtown Melbourne. I think my interests are in learning and teaching in higher education more generally, and in learning in workplaces. And I think it would be fair to say that I'm a kind of not fully in the digital world myself as a native, but I'm engaging with the challenges that produces for me and for all the people around me.
Thanks, Dave. And Lasse, you're next in my lineup.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Lasse. I'm a PhD student in a joint program between Deakin University and University of Copenhagen. My PhD is on learning in higher education, online learning in higher education, and yeah, I'm very interested in technology and learning and the intersection between those. The last half year, I've been working on a project on the influence of the COVID lockdown on university students' experiences. So I think that's also very interesting, and also interesting for this topic, of course, because there's been a lot of digital experiences lately.
And Joe, you're next.
Hi everyone, my name's Joanna Tai. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at CRADLE. I came to higher education research through a background in medicine and health professions education first. My interests are generally assessment and feedback, but more increasingly looking at peer assessment, peer feedback, evaluative judgment, and of course, I've been really interested in how we can achieve more inclusive assessment recently. And I feel quite young on this panel, and I feel qualified to say that even though digital native might be a term that a lot of people use, in fact, perhaps some of us just have had more time to learn about these technologies rather than being natively accustomed to them from the start.
As a person who still gets asked to do the tech support in my house, I would back that up, but I live with 2 teenagers. Trina, you are the last on my slideshow.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm Trina Jordison-Jaw. I'm a senior lecturer, student achievement at Deakin University, and my work is focused primarily on the student experience and graduate preparations, in particular employability and equitable graduate outcomes when they leave us.
And I've realised that once again, I didn't introduce myself. Hello, everyone. I'm Margaret. I have been convening this conference, and I'm also facilitating this panel. And I am also a member of CRADLE with a big interest in how we, what it means to be in a world that is imbued with technology. So this topic is very, very dear to my heart. And I'm going to start off with the first question now. So one of the great promises of the digital is that it enables learning, it enables more effective learning. And in COVID at universities, we switched to being almost entirely digital. It is not really what you call carefully designed educational experience, but we have just jumped. And there's no question that the digital learning is now digital for most of our students. It's every day, it's present. So in this enormous upheaval to emergency remote teaching, which is online, what are the gaps and challenges that arise? And in particular, I'm thinking, Dave, could you speak to how do you think this is influencing how we might design learning experiences?
Yeah. I was very interested in Alicia's keynote this morning, in which she looked at the student response to the change, the emergency teaching. And I've seen data from 2 Australian universities now, and the gap that she showed in which there was a decrease in students' experience was much larger with New York University than it is in any of the Australian universities I've seen. which is an interesting observation, which I think we need to think about. I suspect it's because a lot of Australian universities are much more digitally enabled than we might suspect, mainly because of the kind of the context of Australia and the fact that our students aren't mainly residential within the university or the universities themselves. I think that what we've seen in this shift this year is we've seen some students who've relished the shift, who've seen, well, this enables all sorts of things I was unable to do before. Students at a mature age, students have to travel a long distance, students that are got responsibilities in their lives, caring responsibilities, work responsibilities, and so on. They've said, well, this has really helped. We've made these transitions. A lot of the things that have been going on are kind of half developed digitally, not fully developed digitally, and they've been great for us. But we've also seen another group of students that have been probably adversely affected. We don't know that in the long term yet, but we certainly know at the moment that they are unhappy with the experience. And it seems, as a first cut of the data, which is very early days yet, first cut of the data seems to suggest that these are younger students. These are students that are looking to the university for more than the experience of the getting of the degree in its own right. They want a greater experience. They want interaction. They want to have the social experience of university. So I think what we've been seeing is that we've got a very clear hint that universities are very well able to cope through their design with digital learning for students. But the bit that they can cope with is the kind of the narrow band of the university experience. What I think we have difficulty with at the moment digitally is the wider band. So what we've seen is that people have adapted their courses, they've utilized many of the affordances through the online context, and they've responded extraordinarily well. And I think some of the ratings that students have given us have been kind of a reflection of kind of thanking us for kind of struggling through. It might not be the best that we could do, but we're learning very actively at the moment how to produce very high quality digital resources. The challenge I think we've got going forward is I think we will be able to refine that, and we've now got the momentum to refine that. So our course design and the quality of the interactions we have with students digitally is going to be significantly better than what we've seen in the past. And we can do that. And although there'd be a bit of backsliding if whole of society opens up as normal, which isn't happening just yet, there'll be a bit of backsliding, but I think we've got a one-way journey that we've been on. But I think it's also pointing to the fact that some aspects of this we've been able to cope with much better than others. We haven't been able to cope very well with the interactive dimensions. We've got elements of that within our course design, but a lot of the emergency teaching has kind of stressed the transmittive aspect of teaching, but not the interactive part of teaching. So I think one of the big challenges we've got is to make the interactive part work very well. But also we have as higher education institutions, the huge challenge of the social aspects of the higher education experience, which we've still got to come to grips with.
Thank you. I'll just throw it open for a moment and see if others would like to respond to that. Any thoughts particularly? Lasse, I will ask you, I know I've got another question for you later, but just around comparing the COVID experience in Copenhagen or in Denmark to the one you see in Australia, how does that resonate with you? Do you think those are the same challenges and successes that Dave has described?
Yeah, it's a lot of the same things, definitely. We also saw, I thought it was interesting, Dave mentioned that the students might have been positive, like they gave you points for like their effort, or gave the instructors points for the good effort. We could see we had an early survey and a late survey. In the early one, there was a lot of this positive, we can see you're doing a lot for us. In the late one, by the end of the semester, it was much more negative, much more like, we're really tired of this Zoom streaming. Why is it not working yet? Why is this not clearly communicated yet? So I think somehow there was definitely also, it went down this like optimism about like, oh, thank you for helping us. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The other thing that I thought was interesting about that data that stuck with me, and I can't remember the exact percentages, but having seen both, was that Australia's complaint as students' response about the inadequacy of the internet was significantly, it was something like, I think 50 or 60% of the challenge, and in Denmark it was much, much, much lower. So I think there are also, interestingly, I think the digital isn't equal. We make the assumption that it's the same everywhere, but certainly internationally it's been different. Dave, I think one of the things that Dave has raised, though, and Lasse, you may want to answer this or others, is the social issue here. This is this is a real challenge, and I think there's a general sense that the digital and the social, either we get all excited about social media, but we have trouble designing for it. I'm wondering, Simon, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to say something about that. And I think we need to make sure we don't think of the social as being all the stuff outside of learning, right? The tools are sort of having a dehumanizing effect. We all know what feeling zoomed out means now. And when I was talking to some students, some science students, they were telling me how different it is trying to do, a remote lab compared to being face-to-face in the lab. And you just can't yet have sort of fluid side conversations with your peers that you can initiate at will and break away from. You have these weird, awkward dynamics where you are teleported in and locked into a Zoom breakout room from which you cannot escape. You cannot simply move at will from one cluster to another. You are locked in the room, possibly with peers you don't know, none of whom want to turn on their video, right? It's just weird, okay? That's dehumanizing. And it's no wonder that they're getting sick of that, An interesting one was now they have they're giving instant simulations instead of a real in vitro thing to do, which took time, which gave you downtime to have conversations about stuff, or the fact that if you're having trouble, you can call over the tutor or, the teaching lab assistant, have a quiet conversation with them, show them something. Now you have to share your screen with everybody and have that conversation in public. You can't have a ad hoc on-demand breakout session with that person. So it's all of these fluid dynamics, which are all about learning here. This is not about what I do after the lecture, So now these platform companies, they are raking the dollars in right now. They are also getting a deluge of feedback, which we will hope is going to translate into a much greater accelerated evolution of these environments than might otherwise have happened. So that's the silver lining. So that was just a comment about social fluidity and all the things we know how to do as humans, basically being sort of straitjacketed, even in the learning context, never mind all the other important social stuff Dave was referring to.
Yeah, I think it's a very apt observation, and that the blurring of the boundaries between learning and social behaviour and what it means to be a university student. I think there's it's not easily unpacked. Trina, do you have any questions for us from Slido? Oh, Joe, hang on. Joe would like to ask something. A seek. Go, Joe.
Thanks, Margaret. I think it's really interesting that we're now considering, the deficiencies or the differences in online learning. Deakin, at least, have had large cohorts of cloud students, so students who are studying at a distance for many, many years. And in some research that I did a couple of years ago now, those students who were studying online did already feel that social disconnection and the difficulties in making connections with other people within their course to do the study together. Interestingly, in the research that we're doing right now around students' experiences of emergency remote teaching and learning, some cloud students have actually reported that they felt much more included because everybody was doing it online. And so the usual sort of hiccups and obstacles in terms of being connected with other students were removed for them because everybody else was in the same boat. So just another comment on the social aspects of learning.
Thanks, Jo. Trina.
So I think that Jo's just answered, well, one of the questions or speculations from Liz Johnson, who was pointing to student expectations influencing student perceptions and that differing experience of online students who are expecting to be studying online versus on-campus students. So I think we've answered that one, and there's absolutely some clear evidence of that in the research that we've been doing. The other question that's come up, which could go to you, David, but my other people on the panel might have suggestions, which is, do you have any suggestions for actually improving interactivity or the use of platforms to promote interactivity? Do we have any solutions yet as to what works in terms of the problems that you have raised?
Well, I think Simon's pointed to the fact that the existing platforms, or the existing platforms have basically come out of a kind of a rather poor adaptation of what the platform designers have thought face-to-face teaching is, so that they aren't, well, they're very uncomfortable in terms of the interactive aspects. So I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see a lot more of the emphasis being on how can, this is in the learning space rather than the social space, how can students do all those casual things that Simon was talking about. What we have yet to see is how we can marry the experience of being at university with the social media that students are connected in anyway. So we have an interesting challenge in Australia in that social media works for already existing contacts. Students go to university, they don't go away to university mostly in our context. And a part of that is meeting whole lots of new groups in new ways. And that is the interesting dynamic that we're inhibited by. Now, some of that will occur through the more social learning within the immediate context of the course. But it's about a lot more than that. So where's that other stuff happening?
I could jump on that as well, because I mean, what we're seeing here is I mean, remember, Zoom was not designed for teaching and learning specifically. It was appropriated as a jolly handy platform that we could all leap on, and that many universities already had licenses for. And it just illustrates beautifully how technology is not neutral, right? The affordances are designed for a particular model of how people are assumed they should communicate. So, I mean, I ran a workshop where I wanted to create breakout groups that people could move to freely. Now, that took a bit of work, which required a web page with, say 5 links to the Zoom rooms you could go to. I had to have my colleagues create the other 4 rooms because I couldn't create multiple rooms all at the same time because Zoom didn't think I should be in more than one place at one time. But then the students could move at will between those groups. They could back out of their breakout and jump into another one. That took a bit of pain and effort on my part. That should become super easy to do. That's just a simple example of changing the model that you want to have amongst your students, where you give them the choice of what group you want them to join, as we do often in face-to-face classrooms. It's just a bit painful to do at the moment online, but it shouldn't be.
Margaret, I'm going to say that in terms of David's question about, are Australian universities, have they, had more readiness to respond to the remote teaching? We've had a lot of agreement around that. And a question that the panel might be interested in answering is related to one area where Australia might be behind is in delivering valid, reliable tasks, assessment tasks, where we can make sure students are getting the marks that did the work, but taking it back to the student experience, because that's what this panel is about. Perhaps the panel would like to comment on students' experience of assessment during the pandemic. Perhaps sort of challenges related to assessment, or we could move on.
I think there are a whole host of them, and I think that I think valid and reliable is going to be is another question, and possibly one that we might hold to see if we have time, because it's another sort of body of thinking. I think the one point where I do think it intersects is, and around to the question around interactivity, and I'm going to answer the other question from my perspective, is I think interaction often starts with a task. Assessment often starts with a task, and the intersection between task design and promoting interaction and a good online experience is really strong. And I think Simon gave a wonderful example of sometimes that actually requires quite a bit of bend and commitment from the educator. And I think those things are all still true. I think there's a body of work that suggests the ways that task design is better in the online spaces. I think it's out there and accessible. But I think for me, the key thing is that educator coming through with enthusiasm and thoughtfulness about what those task designs are. And Joe has just reminded me, if you are interested in assessment security and valid tasks, Phil is going to be talking about, in the symposium tomorrow morning, is going to talk a little bit about assessment security as well. So I'm going to wrap up this particular question for the moment, and I think we're going to circle back to all these issues. I suspect it's going to be a bit more, the same themes are going to thread their way through and through, because they're really big ideas that are being talked about here. And Lasse, I'm going to ask you to talk to about the everyday digital and how that influences, I think, what students do. And to answer this in two ways: or you're studying online learning in many different ways, online feedback, but you also are a student who is working at great distance, had to leave a very, nice visit in Melbourne to go back home and pick up things online. So from wearing both those perspectives, how do you think the everyday digital shapes the student experience?
Thanks, Margaret. Obviously, the everyday digital is shaping student experience and all experiences in all ways, in every way. And some of these are very, very positive, and some of them are more problematic, maybe. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when you think about the student experience is that students are experiencing kind of a fight for their attention. Basically, we often think of like digital tools as something that really empowers us to get more output, to get more done, and be more efficient. But they're also basically a fight for our attention. There's a lot of the digital platforms and tools that are basically the main reason for existing is that they want to increase engagement and clicks and minutes spent. So it means that basically among these tools, the ones that survive are the ones that are best at like grabbing our attention away from all the other ones. It's basically a fight for our attention and our concentration. And it means like these qualities like focus or concentration or emotional engagement that are really necessary for learning, they are becoming like scarce resources that a lot of different players are fighting to have. I think in this situation, then you can say that learning always becomes instead of something else. Like you could do something else, or you have to learn, and it basically puts a lot of pressure on the student's attention. And I guess even with like learning experiences that are designed by excellent teams of instructors, it's quite hard for them to compete always with like these interdisciplinary teams of neuroscientists and interaction designers who are basically running the show on Netflix and YouTube and Instagram to basically keep the students' attention there with like little with notifications and interactions and advertisement. And this, I guess, this ability to focus and always ability to focus and basically set yourself there and sit down and study was always a challenge for students. But I guess the new thing is that it's an environment now where a lot of these different players are fighting for your attention all the time. There's another thing that we often mention in this context is like the digital will also give you more access and more flexibility. And I think there's a positive, of course, a positive thing. There's a lot of students, definitely also at Deakin, where the cloud campus version gives a lot of students access to study that wouldn't normally be reached by higher education. I was interviewing students at Deakin and like full online students at Deakin, and they all had this other story in their life. They all had like a work that took most of their time, or they were taking care of children, and basically studying became like the thing they did next to the other thing. You could say the flip side of this flexibility is that studying doesn't become your first priority, and studying is what you put in at the time around when this kind of like when the more important things of your life take place. And this, I guess, this development is also driven by students. We could see in Copenhagen and other Danish universities when we asked the students what part of this like online learning experience from the lockdown semester would you like to continue with afterwards when you're back at campus. And one of the most normal answer they gave was, we would like to have our lectures recorded so we can see them later again afterwards. And I think that's, they of course then highlight, oh, it's really nice, I don't have to go in, I don't lose my time in commuting. And they didn't really see any of the pedagogical advantages maybe of using technology in learning. They only saw it as like a flexibility, they could increase their flexibility. Yeah, I would say like also like another flip side of this is that you start designing for flexibility. Quite often it is something you highlight about the learning experiences. It's more flexible because it's more digital. And I think this comes at the cost of like basically learning in a group. It becomes a very solitary thing to learn with digital in a digital environment. I think that's a problem for, it requires much more self-regulation, it requires much more motivation, and it's basically, you could say we are reaching new students by this, by being very digital, but we're also losing some other kinds of students that don't have this like drive to actually benefits a lot from being on a campus or being in groups when they're learning. I think that was what I have to say about that.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Does anyone have any responses to that? You know, the solitary nature, the self-regulated nature, the great competition for scarce attention resources living in this online world. Simon.
Yes, I think when Lasse was speaking there, I was hearing echoes of The Social Dilemma, you know, that Netflix documentary, which does a nice job of showing just how much expertise and technology the user of a social media app is up against to try and resist the pull back into the app. And it's made me reflect on whether it would be an attractive image instead of a shadowy group of people who are basically trying to buy your attention in order to make money. What if on the other side, there was a team from the university and their job is obviously to engage you as fully and to your greatest ability in the resources that have been so lovingly prepared for you? Is that an attractive image? You know, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're constantly trying to pull the student back onto the platform in the way that a social media channel does. But it's a mode of being that students are also used to. So it's a double-edged sword. Now, the point about focus, managing distractions, I think is absolutely right. You know, I'm hearing again and again about students suddenly realizing they don't have the internal self-regulation to handle being at home so much. They did need that extrinsic structure of a place to be at a particular time. Or they suddenly found that they weren't that sure what they were wanting to study, and now they're not feeling that motivated. So yeah, I think that what can we do as universities to help cultivate those learning to learn skills of self-regulation and planning? Because if you don't have those, you are going to quite quickly come unraveled, I think. Yeah. Oh, the point about lecture recording as well, I think it's very interesting, isn't it? Right? I mean, I'm hearing that all the time. Oh, it's so great now, right? Now, we have to remember we don't have to give students everything they want, because students don't know very much about teaching and learning. I'll put it out there as a statement. Okay, teachers, brackets, like parents, don't know very much about teaching and learning. They know what they've experienced. They know what they like. They're the world experts on their experience of learning, but they don't necessarily know what's effective. So we have to be careful about simply giving them what they are happy with or what they're going to give you good ratings for.
I think that last statement alone could be a very long debate. So again, I'm going to ask for any more thoughts on those the overall contentions that Lasse raised before maybe Trina opening up to if there's anything in the Slido.
I could bite on the lecture recording comment. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. It came up this morning in Alyssa's presentation about, comparing what students say versus what they actually do. And this is something that has also been explored by, I think, a lot of people, how are lecture recordings being used? And I'm aware of some colleagues at Deakin who did some work. They looked at who accessed the lecture recordings and also looked at their performance at the end of semester, and actually found that lecture recordings benefited some students more than others. And what they found was that the international student cohort were the ones that actually benefited from having the ability, they theorized, to be able to play back the recording, understand the concepts, maybe go over the language that was a little bit confusing. And so we must remember that there are differential effects of these things on different groups of students. And so while it might not be so relevant or useful for particular groups who say they like it, there are other groups who might not be speaking up about it who actually really do benefit from it.
I also think at the moment on the lecture recordings that we're in a bit of a transition phase, that lecture recordings are a bit of a safety blanket for students. It's like it's one thing that they can be assured is there. So it's something they can fall back on because a lot of the other stuff doesn't necessarily work very well. Much of the other stuff is more challenging and difficult for them to access. So it's like the idea that, can I borrow your lecture notes? You're not actually going to learn very much, but you will get the perception that you've learned a lot by having the lecture notes in your possession. So it's a sense of having done something without actually having engaged. And it points back to our big challenge, which is to demonstrate to students and find ways of them understanding that learning only occurs when they do things, not when other things are available. So it's not a matter of more resources, it's a matter of engaging with what is there and might move them in a more productive way.
I am going to turn, thanks Dave, I am going to turn to Trina now, because I think lectures still on this, is there anything about the solitary nature? Because that's something that lectures speak to. Online lectures tend to be solitary. And I think it was a point that Lasse raised about this isolation.
So yeah, I mean, I think as a good panel should work, you're answering a lot of questions that are coming up in the conversation. So I think Joe's pointed to some of the answers, but in terms of solitary, we've had someone pointing to whether the current situation is putting more focus on individual knowledge and performance, and whether we might design assessment to promote communal learning, not just through peer assessment and feedback, but at an individual task level, but through facilitating co-creation of communal knowledge. Similarly, we've had another question around design for those accidental interactions that happen, and whether that's through assessment or other learning activities.
Well, that reminds me of what David Kellerman is doing at UNSW in his engineering program, where his, I think it was the final end of semester assessment has been replaced from an exam is no longer what's being used. When he's teaching his large first year class, he's doing some very creative things with Microsoft Teams. Students are allowed to share their answers. This is a summative end of term exam. Students are allowed to share their answers with each other. He's developed an approach which is seems both authentic as well as rigorous in its summative ability. So it's definitely worth checking that out. David Kellerman at UNSW. He's just been sharing some details about how he designed that.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Simon. How do you spell Kellerman?
K-E-L-L-E-R man.
Beautiful, thank you.
It's our kind of habits. We've kind of got into the habit of designing individual assessments which students do in isolation. It's nothing intrinsic to digital or face-to-face or anything like that. It's to do with the history of assessment that we've come out that way. And it's entirely possible to design, as Simon pointed out, examples of things where students collaborate with each other. The only thing that we're limited by is by our own creativity. Now, we might need to incorporate some devices within those things which demonstrate that students can do certain things on their own. But we can have collaborative tasks, and we can have collaborative tasks online. I mean, I was involved in an international program which started 20 years ago, where people didn't meet face-to-face at all. And within each given course unit, the students had to collaborate with another student in another country to do a joint assignment. And this is not new. It's not rocket science. It's just a matter of turning our attention to not seeing assessment as an isolated and individualistic experience, but something that people can do with others. And we can still, on top of that, make assurances that students can do their own work in some other areas. They don't have to do it in isolation for everything. They can do that for sometimes because we want them to work with other people and collaborate to have joint products. But we can do all of those things.
Thanks, Dave. Any last questions before we move on, Trina?
There are many questions. One which probably is for Joe to speak to is any thoughts on how students with digital skills needed for online study are able to participate equitably. So that might be one that you want to hold over, Margaret. Another question was whether students' preference is for synchronous or asynchronous learning, which is a big question to speak for all students. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to talk to that.
Can I just say something briefly about that? That again, we've got into the habit of thinking that teacher and learning interactions are always synchronous. So we actually need to build, and we need to build our students' capacity for asynchronous interaction. And that produces all sorts of equity benefits for students. It produces the benefit for students that are very shy and have difficulty kind of inserting themselves in the conversation. It has benefits for students that have difficulties with English as their first language, and so on and so forth. So if we're going to produce a student for the century that we now live in, we need them to have equal facility in synchronous and asynchronous ways of working and being. And that's the environment we need to prepare students for.
That leads on well to a very nicely phrased question from Liz Johnson, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic has made work more digital too. More learning experiences should be online because that is authentic practice anyway, for example, telehealth, and that will be the normal experience. So do students carry their digital expectations into university study, or is it a separate world?
Anyone feel like jumping in on that?
Can have a go.
Go,
I think it really depends on how individual students, and this is an individual thing, how individuals expect to use their university education into the future. So for instance, in some work that I did with Sean Redmond in the School of Creative Arts around using the video essay as a form of assessment, some students really valued that experience using the tools of media, recording videos, narrating, developing a piece of work that they could use in a portfolio, say if they were going for a job in marketing or for in sort of more performance related areas. Yet other students found it really frustrating to have to learn to use all these digital tools, to have to grapple with all of these things and learn those technologies to come up with that assessment piece. So I think those digital expectations are really personal and really link in with how they see themselves in the future.
Simon.
Yeah, if I can just jump in there as well. I mean, we're back to this expectations thing. Look, I worked for nearly 19 years at the Open University in the UK, right? Our COVID world is business as usual there, right? Students are earning degrees that are just as valuable as at a quotes real university as the early scoffers you know, doubted that any university could really take students through a degree, a proper degree, online and at a distance. Well, that university has just got an amazing blend of staff skill and knowledge of how to do this, especially asynchronously, as Dave was mentioning, to fit around very complex lives by working professionals and busy parents and all the rest of it. Now, that kind of human and technical infrastructure does not happen overnight, but that could be the kind of transition journey that our universities are embarking on now. And there is definitely, you know, a staff upskilling challenge here. You know, I mean, the reason why all these brilliant digital pedagogies are not in action, except in a few outstanding examples, is because staff capacity, right? They simply don't know about these things, and they're very busy, and they're busy trying to nail all their research KPIs as well. So, you know, this takes time, but we are talking about transitioning a socio-technical infrastructure into a different kind of world now. And there are universities around who know how to do that and are sharing their know-how as well. But it's going to be a transitional journey. But our universities, our quotes normal universities, should be increasingly able to articulate to students what their expectations should be if this is the new normal.
Fantastic. And I'm going to stick with you, Simon, and shift the conversation on to this question. And this is within your area of expertise. In the post-digital world, students leave more digital footprints than ever, and we saw Alyssa talk to this a little this morning. And this is even more true post-COVID. Some quarters is great optimism about how to use these digital traces as learning analytics and AI, personal interest of mine, to improve student experience. And at the same time, there's sort of doom and gloom about how we need to be very careful about what these new technologies afford. And from your perspective, what sense do you make of this sort of polar impression of the possibility of digital traces?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we are at a pivotal moment at the moment. Data and analytics and AI are just becoming commodity infrastructure. They are well out of the labs, and they are there to buy by the minute from all the big cloud providers. But there are some big players involved that are causing legitimate concern about the university and its relationships with big multinational platform companies. But I think it's really important that there's no sort of sense of inevitability about how this is going to unfold, right? This is not magic, although it's opaque, and to many people it is magic. You know, how can a machine do this kind of thing? It's not magic. It's conceived and it's funded and it's designed and built by people. But these are people who have very particular ideas about what teaching and learning should look like. But they are making decisions right now, as we speak, about the products that they will be pitching to our universities in just a few months. So we have to make sure that we are savvy enough to know whether these technologies are going to take us on the journey that we want to go on, or whether they are going to actually kind of bake in retrograde pedagogy, because that's all the machine's capable of logging or making sense of. So, you know, I do think that our challenge as universities who do know what the bleeding edge looks like and also know what the limitations of the technologies are, we have to ask, is this technology going to take us in the direction we want to go? Is it going to provide the educational experiences we want to provide? And that just begs the question, well, what kind of graduates do we want to produce? Because if this technology is very good for drill and practice, well, there's some value in that, but if there's now some really good evidence that analytics and AI, when it's done very well, can make learning more efficient. You can simply absorb more and master certain kinds of skills more efficiently than in a traditional delivery, right? The evidence base is pretty good on that. And it's quite startling. And that's in the school sector as well as in higher ed. So the question then is, well, what do we do with the space that releases in our very packed curriculum? If we can learn more efficiently certain kinds of things, what are we going to do with the space that opens up in the curriculum? And hopefully the answer is not, well, let's pack more stuff in that they have got to learn and regurgitate for exams. Let's start creating those kinds of learning activities where they're going to develop the knowledge and skills and dispositions that so many people are calling for now in education and in the business world as well. All of those graduate attributes and 21st century competencies, etc. And that is the challenge really, I think, for data and learning and analytics. It's what Alyssa was talking about earlier today. How do we support higher order kinds of learning? And we've got to turn those into practical tools as well. These are not just power tools for learning scientists and educational researchers to study learning. We want to close those feedback loops and provide really practical tools that inform timely action and intervention and better self-regulation by students. This isn't just dashboards to survey students. We want to close the feedback loop to the students.
Thank you. Any responses?
We've had lots of agreement with you, Simon. Do we want Sheldon's designing the AI teachers is the question. And another question that might be one for you, Simon, was, just to find it again, was whether simulations might play a bigger role in, here we go. This is from Sandy Barker. Does the panel see the inclusion of simulations increasing in university education as a form of interactive learning and assessment?
I think that there could be a significant role for them. They obviously provide very high, if they're well designed, they provide a very high definition picture of the student. It's like dropping into a game. Everything you do, whether you look up, look down, walk forwards, it can be logged. So it provides very fine detail process information, which is very interesting because until now, it's been quite hard to know what process students go through. You know what they came out with because that's what they submit. And you might ask them to reflect or describe their process, but that's whatever they choose to share with you. Now we can see it. And that is a game changer. We just have to be able to make sense of those process changes as well, though.
I'll jump in on the end of that because it is a bit about simulation, which is a little bit of my stomping ground. And I think that you're absolutely right, Simon. I think that, people who work in simulation have sort of little mantras around things like the simulation experience is this much of the learning. It's what you do before and after that make it meaningful. And so access to that data to the participants to help people make meaning of their own experiences is where I think those sorts of simulation experiences can be really valuable because then you're also enabling people to understand about the digital footprints, which are everywhere and which we also need to have some broader learning about. And I also was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to address anything about either what Simon said before about the social and political or the questions that Trina raised. I can see that there is a lot more on the Slido to come. Dave.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we face is that it's a challenge to the way we do business. And traditionally, university teaching has been a kind of cottage industry. in which everyone does their own thing. And essentially it's been about the interaction of one teacher with a group of students. Now, we have stretched that model more and more as student numbers have gone up, so that we now have, you know, one coordinator of a unit with multiple tutors managing people in all sorts of different modes. But it's still the stretching of that traditional cottage industry mode. I think what we're pointing to now with some of these digital affordances is, can we maintain that mode? Is it possible for individuals to put in the design work and the preparation and the setting things up that can enable all these digital affordances to be used on the same basis that we have in the past? So is it a challenge to the ways in which we interact in teaching teams and of doing things collectively, and moving away from the individual sage on the stage model?
Yes, I think it is. I think back to the Open University, where they have course teams who are multidisciplinary. You know, you have the academics, but you have the multimedia designers and the learning designers, and working so that they can deliver an experience at scale is what they've learned to do.
What I think I'm going to do is take us on to the last question in the set, and then I might just open up to the questions that are coming through the Slido, because there seem to be quite a few, and I'm keen to cover this last area, which is really about equity, because a lot of what's I noticed both Lasse and Simon have raised the issue of corporate interests. And I think it's clear that in this digital world, nothing is neutral, and that equity issues will still persist. That's certainly been my observation and experience in researching online learning. And it's a little bit also from what Simon was saying, is that we tend to cement things that we've already been doing. I mean, Neil Selwyn's really made this observation. So it's quite possible that with the shift, instead of making things more equitable, in fact, we make things less equitable, or in fact that new disadvantages are introduced that we hadn't yet realised. So, Jo, I thought I'd ask you to speak to these issues around equity benefits within the post-digital world, and what are the challenges that you think that we will perpetually, I guess, in a way, need to overcome?
Thanks, Margaret. I think the first thing to note is that, as you've already sort of alluded to, that equity can cut on a number of different axes, can be demonstrated, or the inequities can come out in a number of different ways. And increasingly we're thinking about equity and diversity, not just to do with one particular group of students, but to do with a whole range of students and a host of different situations and conditions, which might all need different and bespoke sorts of strategies to sort of accommodate. So and when I say this, I mean things like, we're not just talking about physical disabilities on their own. We're not just talking about people with medical health conditions, including mental health conditions that might impact on their ability to study. We're also thinking about social equity in the sense that there are students from different backgrounds with different equity markers, which don't necessarily determine what they're capable of, but certainly influence the way that they're able to access higher education. And this includes students from Indigenous backgrounds, students in rural, regional and remote areas, low socioeconomic status, first in family, mature age students, and even also culturally and linguistically diverse students, not forgetting our international students. So in terms of benefits, I mean, I think one of the things we've seen is with the increasing move to online education, and this is not a new thing, as Simon noted, the Open University has been around for a very long time. The access to education is definitely part of the post-digital world. There's this idea that education can be accessed anytime, anywhere, by anyone. But along with this, there is this the need for equipment to participate in education. And I think COVID-19 has really demonstrated that we haven't been entirely aware of how some of our students have really been struggling along accessing education through going to the library, going to a public space to use the Wi-Fi. And a few of our students sort of reported those, with the shutdown of Melbourne, that they weren't able to use the ways that they previously did to attend classes, to download large lecture files, lecture recordings, to have to be online to be able to complete particular tasks. Even the idea of online proctored invigilated exams without a stable internet connection and a working laptop with a webcam, that's not a possibility. And so we do have to consider what equipment students need. And yes, they might have signed up to an agreement when they signed on to university that they would have access to this equipment, but that access might be predicated by a whole range of other things. Some wins I think that we're also having include things like having open online textbooks. I know Helen Partridge, who I'm effectively replacing, was perhaps going to speak a little bit about how having textbooks that are online, firstly, so you don't have to purchase a large print copy which may have restricted access. But secondly, making them open means that the text can be altered, reproduced potentially. They are screen readable for people with visual impairments. They are low cost, and they also afford the ability to be adapted in a way that represents the local population, local context, the real sort of reaching the people for whom education, we might say, those people who might gain the most from having an education. So these are all just a few considerations. I guess, like Margaret's already noted, we should remain vigilant about the structures we're recreating in online and post-digital spaces. We need to ensure that we don't just fall into our old easy rhythms of reproducing what was done before. But I think the important thing is, instead of waiting for people to come to us saying, oh, look, I've got a problem with this, or this isn't working for me, that we need to be cognizant of this and to actually go out, be proactive and ask all equity groups, what is your experience? What can we do? How can we make things more equitable, more easy to access? And, what are those sticking points? And I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge. It's not something that we can tick off and say it's done. It's something that we're going to have to continue to do as we remake and develop new ways of educating.
Thanks, Jo. Lasse, I was wondering if you would like to respond to that as wearing the student hat.
Yeah. Well, I think it were all good points. Something I always think about when we talk about open textbooks and open educational resources in general is that the promise seems to be so big, but there's very little use of them when you think about the big promise there is. And I think an issue is that it puts a lot of work on the instructor to pre-check the quality and edit the textbooks and stuff like this. So I think that we are ending up in a situation where we then still often use commercial products. And we don't get this advantage of the open educational resources because the commercial products are more geared on saving you time, basically. So it's again like what we mentioned earlier, that's a lot about do the instructors have the time to actually use this kind of materials that actually give us this advantage that we all see is out there with the flexibility and making it local, relevant examples, etc. And then another thing, I think there's a lot of resources now, learning resources that are not coming from the institutions. Of course, MOOCs, but also a lot of other ones, and a lot of them come from, again, commercial players, or they're driven a lot by learning analytics also, as we spoke about before. And this has an internal logic where it makes the learning, it makes the courses shorter and shorter, it makes the videos shorter and shorter, because that's what's dictated by the learning materials. And I think having yeah, I think like introducing them into your university learning to get some advantage of like getting more examples or more online, I think is often like yeah, a problem actually, because it doesn't then have the advantage of the open educational resources that we discussed before.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks, Joe, for that very, I think, really comprehensive answer. And I note we've only got 11 minutes left on our panel. So what I'm going to suggest is we spend that on these open questions. I can see some things are being upvoted up the Slido. And I think, you know, I'm hearing lots of themes, sort of themes threading through things that Simon and Dave and Joe and Lasse are all saying. So I think now's the time to throw open. Trina, what have we got?
So our most popular question is from Beverly Oliver, which is, it's quite likely we will see globally more mature learners returning to study to secure or fund work. What should we be thinking about with regard to redesigning assessment and digital learning for not so young learners? These people have loads of life and work experience.
Well, I think that's extremely exciting opportunity. I mean, it's, you know, you see it, just the difference between teaching postgrads in a master's program and students who are in school before Christmas, right? I mean, they're bringing so much life experience, even if they're not that old. The students have got some real world pain and success and people skills and all the rest, all that richness which can be used in and valued when you're designing the assessments. So yeah, I think there's just so much more to work with in that sense.
I think there will be an extremely low level of tolerance for these kinds of students to engage in the kind of assessment practices that we've had in the past. They're going to say, this is a joke. This is a waste of time. This is actually not addressing my learning. This is not something I want to do. So it's going to produce probably more pressure on us to change assessment than it is to change the courses. We've probably got a greater degree of flexibility within the course side of things than the way things are getting assessed. So I think we're going to have a huge emphasis on more creative, more responsive, more flexible ways in which students can demonstrate the learning outcomes of the thing that they've signed up for. Why should they all do it in the same way? Why should they answer all the same questions? There's a whole lot of things that we take for granted in assessment that is just not valid anymore. And these kinds of students will focus our attention on it. But what they say is going to be applicable to everyone else as well. So one of the biggest changes we've seen in COVID is not probably so much in the teaching, but it's on the assessment. So all those final exams have not been able to go ahead. A few of them have been held over for very, very good reasons, but probably 90% of them haven't happened and the world hasn't collapsed. So I think we need to think very carefully about whether we need to engage in the practices that we think are normal, commonplace, taken for granted in the way we examine students. And that's going to be a big issue in the future.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think that's a very comprehensive answer to that question. So we might move on, Trina, to the next one, if there is one.
So we've had a number of questions and comments related to, well, first of all, commending Jo on her focus on social equity and digital poverty. And Jo, you focused a lot on the access issues in terms of technology, but there's been a lot of questions related to skills, both digital skills and enabling equitable participation through skills development, both digital as well as self-regulation, and a lot of comments around the support needed to transition. So perhaps also skills related to resilience. And we have one particular question here, which kind of captures some of that. Do you think that there has been insufficient research and attention in practice to helping students understand, practice, and reflect on what self-regulation means? Just adapting courses to students' perceived needs is not promoting self-regulation.
The short answer, I think, is yes. The longer answer is something like, well, we've done some work in the space of transition to university, transition to higher education, and we saw some work earlier today about some of those challenges that students face when they come into higher education, particularly from a previously different kind of setting, a different context, a different type of learning. And perhaps we don't spend enough time helping students to realise what university is all about. I think everyone comes into university, wherever they came from previously, with some preconceived ideas about what it's like to be a university student. You kind of expect certain things. And I think, especially this year, the expectations have not been met. The expectations and our expectations have been evolving as well in terms of what we expect students to do at university. So I guess at this crossroads, perhaps we both need to, as educators ourselves, expectations of students, and as how we communicate those expectations to students, we need to take a step back and consider what's really important and how would we scaffold and promote students to do things that sort of align with our ideas about how education works in this online world. I don't think there's a particular one strategy or one answer that we could provide at this point in time, given things are still evolving. But certainly the need for self-regulation is a lot higher. And I think, as Lasse mentioned before, all these things giving us rewards, taking our attention, this is perhaps opposite to what we need to happen in terms of self-regulation. And perhaps that gulf is getting bigger between what we experience in our everyday lives and what we think university should be. So yeah, we need to spend more time talking about it and making it explicit, because I think there's a lot of hidden stuff that hasn't been surfaced around what should university be like, or how should a student be at university.
Just from my perspective around learning analytics, one of the dominant theories in the field of learning analytics is self-regulation theory. There's a lot of attention on how are we going to create environments that build those kinds of qualities. And so, again, we're back to this point I was trying to make, that there is that these kinds of tools that track process and close feedback loops are not pedagogically or epistemologically neutral in any sense. They bake in a particular worldview about what we think learning looks like, what we think assessment looks like, and you either make those commitments by accident or by design. So, one nightmare scenario is that students grow dependent on continuous prodding from an AI agent. They might need that at the beginning, but we need to be able to phase that scaffolding out in order to not turn out students who have just grown dependent on AI prodding. So, these are mindful decisions we can make, and those are the kinds of ways we need to be thinking about our educational technology.
Simon, when you just said, self-regulation learning is a theory commonly used in learning analytics, it also made me think about newer sort of flavors of self-regulated learning, like co-regulated learning or socially shared regulation of learning, which might also help us consider the social aspects of learning. And so perhaps we need to expand our thoughts on, how we apply those theories to what we do.
Agreed.
I think we have time for one more question, Trina. A very quick one, though.
So most of them have been covered in one way or another. So I'm just going to throw in the question of what do these challenges and inequities mean for how we support students transitioning out of university? We've spoken a lot about the transition during and through the pandemic, but what does this mean for their futures and transition out into the workforce?
I think only one person has time to answer. So who's going to jump? No one is. Dave, you have your microphone off, so I'm afraid.
Well, I think this is where we come back to the world of practice. We need to look at the practices that students are going to be engaged in the world of work. And we need to ask ourselves, are the kind of things we do in university at all able to equip them for the kinds of learning they're going to do in work. Not the work itself, because there's no way a university education without a whole lot of other stuff on top of it, which is local and contextual, can work. So the work-ready graduate isn't about going in there and doing the full-on task immediately. It's about, can the graduates that we produce adapt sufficiently and have the kind of skills they need in order to learn unbelievably well in workplaces. So I think we've actually got to look closely at what kinds of learning challenges students will face in work, and then work back. And there's some obvious things that happen when we look at the world of work. People learn with other people. They learn from each other. They actually don't learn so much from formal training programs. They learn from identifying what they need to know. They ask themselves questions about, what does it constitute to do this work well? And we need to think in a transition preparation in, are we equipping them with those meta skills that they need in order to learn further in their next step?
Thanks, Dave. That's a wonderful place to kind of draw things together and leave it. My reflection on this conversation is how much almost everything that people have said makes me think that we need to interrogate our expectations, both about our pedagogy, about technology, and about the students around us, because some things are holding true, some things aren't. Some things, you know, are saying at the same time, this is working 20 years ago, but at the same time, there are new things. And I think in order to chart through that maze, we do need to constantly look at the reasons why we are making the choices we're making, and not just really be aware that it's very easy to take things for granted. It's very easy to take for granted that technology will lead to things being better. It's very easy to take for granted that our student populations are all the same, or that they're going to be the same as they were. It's very easy to take for granted that new things will change us in certain ways. So for me, that is a real sort of standout message from today. Thank you to all the panelists. Really tremendous to hear your insights from Sydney to Berlin to Melbourne, and your expertise and your thoughtful answers. Thanks to Trina for moderating the questions, to all the people who asked tremendous questions, and to Paige for technical support. Really looking forward to seeing more of you tomorrow. By you, I mean the audience that I actually can't see, at the rest of the conference. Have a good evening or morning, depending on where you are coming from.